The year is 1941. Lieutenant Yasuhiko Kuroi sits in the cockpit of his new fighter, the Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa. Outside, the tropical heat of Southeast Asia shimmers on the airfield. His hand rests on the control stick, impossibly light, almost delicate. He can turn this aircraft with 2 fingers. In 40 seconds, he will take off for his first combat mission. In 40 minutes, he will understand the terrible bargain Japan has made. This is the story of a fighter aircraft that could outmaneuver anything in the sky. But it is really about the moment an entire nation chose beautiful philosophy over brutal reality, and what it reveals about the seductive danger of valuing honor over survival, tradition over adaptation, and dying well over living at all. December 1941, the Empire of Japan launches simultaneous attacks across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. American, British, and Dutch forces scramble to respond. In the skies over Malaya, Burma, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, Allied pilots encounter something they have never seen before, a Japanese fighter that turns impossibly tight, that climbs like it weighs nothing, that dances through the air as if gravity is merely a suggestion. They call it the Oscar, the Allied reporting name for the Ki-43 Hayabusa. In Japanese, Hayabusa means peregrine falcon. The name is perfect. The aircraft is graceful, predatory, beautiful in motion. Allied pilots report engagements that defy their training, Zeros and Oscars that can turn inside any maneuver, that seem to pivot in mid-air, that make Western fighters feel clumsy and heavy by comparison. For 6 months, the Oscar and its cousin, the Zero, establish air superiority across millions of square miles of conquered territory. For 6 months, it seems like Japanese fighter philosophy has been vindicated, but there is something the Allied pilots cannot see from outside these aircraft, something the Japanese pilots feel every time they climb into the cockpit, a truth so uncomfortable that acknowledging it feels like betrayal. To understand what happened in the cockpit of the Hayabusa, you first need to understand what Japan believed. They believed that the soul of the warrior, the spirit of Bushido, could overcome material disadvantage. They believed that maneuverability in combat was paramount, that the superior pilot in the more agile aircraft would always prevail. They believed that heavy armor and powerful armament were signs of defensive thinking, of fear, of a lack of fighting spirit. They believed that accepting death was strength, that fearing death was weakness, and that building aircraft to protect pilots was an insult to their courage. These were not casual beliefs. They were doctrine, taught at the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force academies, reinforced through training, woven into the cultural fabric of military service. The Ki-43 Hayabusa was the physical embodiment of these beliefs, and like all beautiful philosophies confronted by war, it would be tested not by other philosophies, but by physics, by statistics, and by the bodies of young men falling from the sky. The Hayabusa's design philosophy was elegant and internally consistent. Start with the lightest possible airframe. Remove everything unnecessary. No armor plate behind the pilot's seat, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no heavy armament. The production Ki-43I carried just 2 7.7mm machine guns. Later models upgraded to 2 12.7mm guns. But even then, the armament was light compared to American fighters carrying 6 or 8 heavy machine guns. The result was an aircraft that weighed just 1,580 kilograms empty. For comparison, a P-40 Warhawk weighed 2,812 kilograms empty. The Hayabusa was nearly half the weight. This translated into performance that seemed almost magical to pilots trained in Western aircraft. The Hayabusa could complete a 360-degree turn in roughly 11 seconds at combat speeds. A P-40 needed over 20 seconds. In a turning fight, the Hayabusa could get on an enemy's tail and stay there. Climb rate was exceptional, service ceiling was high, and the controls were so light, so responsive, that pilots described flying the Hayabusa as effortless, intuitive, like the aircraft was reading their thoughts. Lieutenant Kuroe experienced this during his first combat sortie over Burma in January 1942. 4 Hayabusas encountered 6 British Brewster buffaloes. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. The buffaloes tried to turn with the Hayabusas. Fatal mistake. Kuro found himself on a buffalo's tail within seconds. The British pilot threw his aircraft into increasingly desperate turns. Kuro stayed with him effortlessly, 2 fingers on the stick. The buffalo could not escape, could not outturn, could not climb away. Kuro's wingman shot it down. They repeated the process with 3 more buffaloes. Only 2 British fighters escaped, and only because they stopped trying to turn and dove for the ground at maximum speed, accepting the vulnerable position to escape an unwinnable fight. Back at the airfield, Kuroi and his squadron mates were euphoric. The British fighters had been helpless. The doctrine worked. The philosophy was correct. Maneuverability was supreme. But that night, in his quarters, Kuro cleaned his aircraft, and he noticed something. Bullet holes. Not many, just 3. From a buffalo that had gotten a brief firing opportunity before Kuro's wingman forced it to break off. 3 bullets. 2 had punched through the thin aluminum skin of the fuselage. 1 had passed less than 30 centimeters from the fuel tank. If that round had struck the tank, the Hayabusa would have erupted in flames. No fire suppression system, no self-sealing tanks, just raw fuel and thin aluminum. Kuroe stood there looking at those holes. The doctrine had worked. They had won decisively. But he could not stop thinking about those 30 centimeters, about how close victory had come to turning into fire and death. He did not write about this in his report. What would he say? That he was afraid? That the aircraft designed around Bushido principles made him feel vulnerable? That protection might matter as much as maneuverability? These thoughts felt like weakness. So he pushed them down and prepared for the next mission. This was the crack that would eventually shatter everything. Not the external defeats, not the tactical losses, but the slow accumulation of internal doubt. The growing awareness that the aircraft they flew was optimized for a version of air combat that existed more in philosophy than in reality. Here is what the doctrine assumed. It assumed that air combat was primarily a matter of dogfighting, of turning battles where superior agility and pilot skill determined outcomes. It assumed that Japanese pilots would always be better trained, more experienced, more willing to accept risk than their opponents. It assumed that the spiritual advantage of Bushido would compensate for material disadvantages. It assumed that the war would be short, that Japan would achieve decisive victories before the Allies could mobilize their industrial capacity. Every single one of these assumptions would be systematically disproven, not by argument, not by alternative philosophy, but by the simple, brutal mathematics of attrition. The Hayabusa's early successes were real. Between December 1941 and May 1942, Ki-43 units established air superiority across Southeast Asia. They decimated Allied air forces in Malaya, Burma, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. But those victories were won against opponents who were unprepared, poorly equipped, often flying obsolete aircraft, and almost always outnumbered. The Hayabusa pilots were not just flying maneuverable aircraft. They were elite, extensively trained, and experienced. Many had combat experience from the war in China. They knew their aircraft intimately. They worked together with practiced coordination. They were, in early 1942, probably the best fighter pilots in the world, flying an aircraft perfectly matched to their skills. But wars are not won by elite pilots alone. Wars are won by industrial capacity, by training pipelines, by replacement rates, by the ability to absorb losses and continue fighting. And here Japan's philosophy contained a fatal flaw. The Hayabusa was designed to maximize the effectiveness of the individual skilled pilot. But what happens when that pilot is killed? What happens when you have trained someone for years, given them hundreds of hours of flight time, taught them every nuance of air combat, and then they get hit by a single lucky burst of machine gun fire and die because the aircraft has no armor? What happens when your training pipeline cannot replace losses fast enough? What happens when the enemy starts producing pilots and aircraft faster than you can shoot them down? The Americans were about to provide an answer, and that answer would destroy the entire philosophical framework that created the Hayabusa. By mid-1942, the nature of the air war was changing. American pilots were learning. Not learning to outturn the Hayabusa, that was impossible, but learning not to try. Learning to use their advantages instead. American fighters could not turn with a Hayabusa, but they were faster, more heavily armed, more durable. So American pilots stopped turning. They developed tactics that played to their strengths. Boom and zoom. Dive from altitude, make a single high-speed firing pass, climb away before the Hayabusa could react, repeat. Never get slow, never turn. Use speed and altitude as life insurance. The Hayabusa's greatest advantage, its maneuverability, became irrelevant. You cannot outturn someone who refuses to turn with you. And when American pilots did land hits, those hits mattered. 650 caliber machine guns poured out a stream of heavy rounds. The Hayabusa's light structure shredded under that kind of fire. Fuel tanks ruptured and ignited. Control surfaces were blown away. Pilots were killed in their cockpits. Captain Kenji Shimada flew Hayabusas over New Guinea in late 1942. He was an ace, credited with 11 kills. He had survived the campaigns in Malaya and the Philippines. He knew the Hayabusa's capabilities intimately. In October 1942, his unit encountered a formation of P-38 Lightnings. The Americans dove from above, made firing passes, and climbed away before the Hayabusas could engage. Shimada watched two of his wingmen get hit. One exploded mid-air, fuel tank ignited. The other went down trailing smoke, the pilot probably already dead. The Lightnings disappeared into the distance, using their speed to escape. Shimada's unit could not catch them, could not force them into a turning fight, could only watch and try to evade and hope they were not the next target. After the engagement, Shimada sat in his cockpit on the airfield. His hands were shaking. Not from fear of death, he had long since accepted that possibility, but from something worse, the realization that skill did not matter. That all his training, all his experience, all his ability to outfly anyone in a turning battle meant nothing if the enemy refused to fight that way. The Americans were not cowards for refusing to turn. They were smart. They had learned the game was rigged and changed the rules, and there was nothing the Hayabusa pilots could do about it. That night, Shimada wrote something in his diary that he would never have said aloud. He wrote that the aircraft felt like a trap, that every time he climbed into the cockpit, he was aware that one bullet in the wrong place would kill him, that the light controls and incredible agility felt less like advantages and more like compensation for fundamental vulnerability, that he was starting to envy American pilots their heavy, armored, brutish aircraft that could absorb damage and keep flying. He crossed out these lines before anyone could see them, but he could not cross them out of his mind. This is how certainty dies in war, not in a single moment of revelation, but in the accumulation of experiences that can no longer be explained away. The doctrine said maneuverability was supreme, but Shimada's dead wingman suggested otherwise. The doctrine said fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage, but fighting spirit does not stop 50 caliber rounds. The doctrine said fearing death was weakness. But Shimada was beginning to understand that the line between accepting death and seeking it was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. The Japanese Army Air Force did try to improve the Hayabusa. The Ki-43-2 introduced a more powerful engine, the Nakajima Ha-115, increasing output to 150 horsepower. This improved speed somewhat and slightly enhanced climb rate. The armament was upgraded to two 12.7mm Ho-103 machine guns. The Ki-43-3, which appeared in limited numbers in 1944, pushed the engine to 1,230 horsepower and added some armor protection and partially self-sealing fuel tanks. But these improvements came too late and did not address the fundamental philosophy. The Hayabusa was still built around the idea that maneuverability mattered most, and by 1943, the air war had moved far beyond that assumption. American fighters were getting better. The P-38 Lightning, P-47 Thunderbolt, and P-51 Mustang were all faster, more heavily armed, and far more durable than the Hayabusa. They could dive faster, climb higher, and absorb punishment that would destroy a Hayabusa. But more important than the aircraft was the system behind them. America was producing fighters by the thousands. American training programs were graduating new pilots continuously. When an American pilot was killed, he was replaced within weeks. When a Hayabusa pilot was killed, he represented years of training and experience that could not be easily replaced. Japan's training pipeline was never designed for a long war of attrition. It was designed to produce elite pilots for decisive battles. By 1943, Japan was losing experienced pilots faster than they could train replacements. And the replacements they did produce received less training, less flight time, less preparation. These new pilots climbed into Hayabusas and faced American veterans in superior aircraft. The results were predictable, loss rates climbed, entire units were wiped out. And the Hayabusa, which had once seemed like the vindication of Japanese fighter philosophy, became a coffin. The most damning evidence came not from American reports but from Japanese pilots themselves. Warrant Officer Satoshi Anabuki, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces, flew the Hayabusa throughout the war. He loved the aircraft. He understood its strengths. He achieved over 50 victories in the type. But in his post-war writings, he was brutally honest about its limitations. He wrote that flying the Hayabusa in the later war years felt like going into battle unarmed, that the lack of protection meant that even minor hits were often fatal, that watching less experienced pilots get killed in aircraft that could not protect them was worse than his own fear of death. He wrote about the psychological weight of knowing that the doctrine he had been taught, the philosophy he had believed in, was sending young men to die in aircraft that prioritized aesthetics over survivability. These were not the words of a coward. Anabuki was fearless, skilled, and dedicated. But even he could not ignore the evidence. The Hayabusa was a failure, not because it was poorly designed for its intended purpose, but because its intended purpose was based on assumptions that war had proven catastrophically wrong. Here is where we need to slow down and understand something about institutional thinking and cultural momentum. The flaws of the Hayabusa were obvious to the pilots flying it by 1943. Reports came back from the front describing the desperate need for better protection, heavier armament, more durable aircraft. But changing course required more than acknowledging technical problems. It required admitting that the entire philosophical framework was flawed. It required saying that Bushido principles, when applied to aircraft design, got people killed. It required accepting that the enemy's approach, building heavy, protective, materially superior aircraft, was correct. And this was a bridge too far for many in the Japanese military hierarchy. To accept this would mean questioning everything. If the fighter doctrine was wrong, what else might be wrong? If American industrial philosophy produced better results than Japanese spiritual philosophy, what did that say about the core beliefs of the empire? These were not questions that institutions ask willingly. So instead, reports were filed, read, and often ignored. Pilots were told to have more fighting spirit. Units were reshuffled. Tactics were adjusted at the margins. But the fundamental philosophy remained unchanged. General Tateo Kato, who commanded Hayabusa units in Burma, understood this dynamic perfectly. He wrote in his reports that the Ki-43 needed armor and heavier guns. He argued for new aircraft designs that balanced maneuverability with protection. But he also knew that pushing too hard meant being labeled defeatist, meant being accused of lacking faith in Japanese capabilities, meant risking his career and his ability to help his pilots at all. So he pushed where he could, protected his men as best he could, and watched the casualties mount. He was killed in combat in May 1942, flying a Hayabusa, shot down by anti-aircraft fire. His aircraft had no armor. The burst that killed him might have been survivable in an American fighter. This is the weight of expertise in a system that confuses faith with wisdom. Kato knew the truth. He tried to communicate it, but the system was not built to hear uncomfortable truths. It was built to reinforce existing beliefs until those beliefs were shattered by defeat. By 1944, the situation was desperate. American forces were pushing toward Japan. Air battles over the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa were slaughterhouses. Japanese pilots, many with minimal training, flew Hayabusas against waves of American fighters flown by experienced pilots. The technological gap had become unbridgeable. A P-51 Mustang could do everything a Hayabusa could do except turn as tightly, and it could do everything else better. It was faster, climbed better at high altitude, had longer range, carried more ammunition, and could absorb damage. A Hayabusa pilot who made even a small mistake died. An American pilot who made the same mistake often survived. The Hayabusa required perfection. The Mustang forgave errors. In a long war of attrition, forgiveness beats perfection every time. The final indignity came in 1945. As Japan faced invasion, the Hayabusa was increasingly relegated to kamikaze missions. The aircraft that had been designed to showcase the skill of elite pilots was now being flown by barely trained teenagers on one-way missions. The lightweight that had made it maneuverable made it a suitable kamikaze platform. It required less fuel for a one-way trip. It was available in numbers, and the pilots flying it were not expected to return. The philosophical circle was complete. An aircraft designed around the principle that accepting death was strength became a weapon that required death. The Hayabusa, which had once symbolized Japanese air power at its peak, now symbolized Japan's desperation. And the pilots who flew these missions knew it. They wrote letters home. They said goodbye to friends. They took off knowing they would never land. Some believed in the mission. Others did not. But belief or doubt made no difference. The aircraft they flew was the physical manifestation of a philosophy that had run its course, and they were trapped inside it. When the war ended, the Hayabusa's record was mixed in ways that tell you everything about the gap between doctrine and reality. In the hands of skilled pilots early in the war, it was devastating. It achieved a positive kill ratio against Allied aircraft in 1942 and early 1943. But as the war dragged on, as experienced pilots died and were replaced by novices, as American aircraft improved and American pilots learned, the Hayabusa became a death trap. By 1945, loss rates were catastrophic. Over 5,900 Hayabusas were built. The vast majority were destroyed. And inside them, thousands of pilots died, many of them killed by design decisions that prioritized philosophy over protection. This is the uncomfortable arithmetic of the Pacific Air War. Japan built an aircraft around beautiful ideas about maneuverability, fighting spirit, and the warrior ethos. America built aircraft around brutal pragmatism, industrial capacity, and keeping pilots alive. The philosophical approach produced an aircraft that was magnificent to fly. The pragmatic approach produced aircraft that were effective to fight in. And war does not reward magnificence, it rewards effectiveness. After the war, surviving Hayabusa pilots were interviewed by American intelligence officers. The conversations were illuminating. Many pilots still spoke of the Hayabusa with affection. They described the joy of flying such a responsive aircraft, the satisfaction of outmaneuvering opponents, the beauty of the design. But when pressed, when the formal questions were done and conversations became more personal, many admitted what they could never have said during the war: that they had been afraid every time they flew, that they had envied American pilots their armor and heavy guns, that they had known in their hearts that the doctrine was flawed, but could not say so, that they had watched friends die in flames and wondered if those deaths were necessary, or if they were sacrifices to a philosophy that valued tradition over adaptation. These were not confessions of cowardice. These were admissions of suppressed doubt. The doubt that comes when reality conflicts with ideology and ideology forbids you from acknowledging the conflict. One pilot, whose name was not recorded in the interview transcripts, said something that captures the psychological weight of the Hayabusa perfectly. He said that flying the Ki-43 felt like being handed a sword and told to fight men with rifles. The sword was beautiful. The sword required skill. The sword connected you to tradition and honor. But the men with rifles killed you before you could get close enough to use it. And when you pointed this out, you were told that you lacked fighting spirit, that you were not using the sword correctly, that the problem was not the weapon, but the warrior. He said that by 1944, climbing into a Hayabusa felt like participating in a lie that everyone knew was a lie, but no one could acknowledge. That the young pilots who replaced the dead believed because they had no experience, and the surviving veterans knew better, but could not speak. And this conspiracy of silence killed people. This is the part of the story where the aircraft becomes secondary and the human truth becomes primary. The Hayabusa was not a bad aircraft in absolute terms. It was an exceptionally good aircraft for the mission it was designed for, which was turning dogfights with opponents of similar capability. The problem was not the engineering. The problem was the mission definition. The problem was the assumption that air combat would primarily consist of turning dogfights. The problem was the philosophical commitment to maneuverability über alles. The problem was the institutional inability to admit when assumptions were wrong. And these were not engineering problems. They were human problems. Problems of ego, of national pride, of cultural momentum, of the difficulty of changing course once you have committed to a path. The Hayabusa killed people not because Nakajima engineers were incompetent, but because the system that defined requirements for the Hayabusa valued ideology over outcomes. Now think about this in broader terms. Think about how often humans make this same mistake, how often we commit to an approach based on beautiful ideas, and then defend that approach against evidence because admitting error feels like weakness. How often we mistake stubbornness for strength, tradition for wisdom, and faith for clear thinking. The Hayabusa is an extreme example because the consequences were measured in bodies falling from the sky. But the pattern is universal. We all carry beliefs that we defend past the point where evidence suggests we should revise them. We all participate in systems that prioritize narrative over reality. We all, at some level, know truths we cannot speak because speaking them would threaten our place in the system. The Hayabusa pilots were not unique. They were human. And their struggle, the struggle between believing what you have been taught and acknowledging what you have experienced, is one every thinking person faces. The final assessment of the Hayabusa must therefore be split between the technical and the philosophical. Technically, it was a remarkable aircraft. It achieved its design goals. It was light, maneuverable, and effective in the hands of skilled pilots under specific conditions. But philosophically, it represented a catastrophic failure. It embodied a worldview that valued tradition over adaptation, that confused aesthetic elegance with practical effectiveness, that treated pilot death as acceptable cost rather than design failure. And this worldview killed people, not metaphorically, actually killed them. Young men who climbed into cockpits, trusting that the aircraft had been designed to give them the best chance of survival, and victory, when in reality it had been designed to validate a philosophy. This is the ultimate indictment. Not that the Hayabusa was slow or poorly armed or fragile, though it was all those things by 1944, but that it represented the triumph of ideology over evidence, of doctrine over experience, of what people wanted to believe over what was actually true. When you look at photographs of the Hayabusa now, in museums or in historical archives, you see an elegant aircraft, clean lines, graceful proportions. It looks fast, even standing still. It is easy to understand why pilots loved flying it. It is easy to imagine the thrill of throwing such a responsive aircraft through the sky. But you cannot see the missing armor. You cannot see the unprotected fuel tanks. You cannot see the light armament. And you cannot see the faces of the thousands of pilots who died inside these aircraft, killed by design decisions made years before they ever touched a control stick. The Hayabusa is beautiful, but its beauty is stained by the blood of the men who flew it. And that stain tells a story about the cost of choosing philosophy over reality, tradition over innovation, and dying beautifully over living effectively. This is what the Hayabusa teaches us, that the most dangerous lies are the ones we want to believe. That institutional momentum can continue long past the point where individuals within the institution know the path is wrong. That questioning sacred doctrine, even when lives depend on it, is psychologically harder than continuing to believe. That beautiful philosophies, when tested by reality, often reveal themselves as beautiful ways to die. The Japanese pilots who flew the Hayabusa were brave. They were skilled. They were dedicated. They deserved an aircraft designed to keep them alive so they could continue fighting. Instead, they received an aircraft designed to validate the beliefs of men who would never sit in its cockpit, never feel the terror of catching fire at 10,000 feet, never experience the moment when training and skill and fighting spirit all prove insufficient against simple physics. The Hayabusa was Japan's Oscar, and it sacrificed its pilots for an idea that should have died long before they did.